A few weeks ago, I facilitated a workshop on burnout for a group of Asian Americans. There were about 40 plus people who showed up to this workshop. I came prepared to talk about my own story of burnout, my own story of recovery, boundaries, stress, and all the things that we think of when we typically talk about burnout. But I left thinking about something completely different. In fact, I learned so much from the women who were in that room. Because what surprised me wasn't that they were tired. I definitely expected that. What surprised me was that they were completely ready for change. They were ready to question the responsibilities they had carried for years, sometimes for some of them decades. They were ready to ask whether the life that they had inherited, the roles they had inherited, and the expectations they had inherited were still working for them. And that realization has really stayed with me because some of them were much younger and saying these things. And I was like, oh my God, if I was in my 20s and I had this realization that these expectations were not something that I had to fulfill, that it was something that was just sort of placed upon me, and I, in a very unconscious and unquestioning way, just stepped into that. Could you imagine just the different person I would be today? But that being said, today I want to share the 3 biggest learnings that I walked away from that room. Not personal details, of course, of what was discussed in that room. That's private and confidential. But I want to share with you what I learned from this incredible group of primarily Asian American women. Okay, so here's the first takeaway. Women are ready to lay this down. They're like, we're done. So one of the strongest themes that emerged during the workshop was that women, of course, are tired of carrying responsibilities that seem to endlessly accumulate. Not just physical responsibilities, emotional responsibilities, mental responsibilities, the responsibility of remembering, planning, doing, anticipating, managing, supporting, holding everything together. Oh, the list feels like it goes on. And what struck me wasn't simply that women were exhausted. It was that they were beginning to question the arrangement itself. Questions like, why am I carrying this? Who decided that this was my responsibility? Does this still belong to me? Do I even want this? And I thought, I am almost 46 years old, and I was so in awe of this shift that I was hearing from the room. Like, I thought I was literally going in to give permission for them to rethink. And they were already like, no. These women were already like, no, we don't need permission to rethink. We know that we are ready to rethink this. So walk me through the process. Like, how do we rethink this? What do we do? Like, they were so action oriented around the labor that they no longer wanted to carry. They were questioning why, who made this up? I mean, to me, it's taken me a better part of my adult life to realize that the structures that were given to us, that I was never part of that decision-making process. But these women already realized that they are the center of that decision-making process. They are already in the process of questioning that structure. And I felt that to be so encouraging and frankly so hopeful, because for so many of us, especially as women, especially as Asian American women, we have been taught to accept responsibility before we've even stopped to evaluate it. I know that was something that I really stepped into. We've been taught to help, to accommodate, to sacrifice, to keep the peace, to make things work, and many of us become insanely good at it. But what I heard in this room was something entirely different. Women were saying, I don't want this anymore. I think we need to rethink this. We need a different arrangement. And honestly, I found that to be so incredibly hopeful and frankly empowering. I was in awe of the women in this room. I literally said to the executive director, like, I don't know what I have to teach here, because this is really about just pulling all of our incredible minds together to start rethinking what we can do differently. Okay, here we go with number 2. Women are putting themselves in the center of the decision making. This was probably the coolest insight, honestly, that I feel like I walked away from this workshop with, because I was like, oh my God, women are saying I. Whereas in my past, it used to be like, Who do I need to put ahead of myself? Not even recognizing that I had needs. And so I found this to be so exciting, especially in the context of I have a daughter and I want her to be empowered to say me first. For some of the women who openly shared, I noticed how often their decisions had historically been organized around everyone else's needs, me included. So what the kids need, what their spouse needs, what their parents need, what work needed, what everyone else needed in absence of ever contemplating what do I actually need in this moment. And somewhere along the way, some of these women had completely disappeared from the equation and they were pissed about that. That was the best part. They were so angry. And I'm not at all saying like I'm laughing at their suffering. I'm just saying, oh my God, I loved the emotion that was expressed on this call. It was incredible to see women who were so over it. It was empowering and it was exciting. And there's a deep, deep sadness and there was anger in that realization. And I loved that was actually being expressed on this call. I mean, the women felt so permitted to be so upset. Some of them were crying. Some of them were just, you could just hear the heat. You could just hear how over it they were. And I loved feeling that from them. There was a sadness that some of the women, we spend years carrying everything for everyone. And rarely do we hear questions like, how are you doing? Are you okay? Do you need help? Do you need something? What can I do for you? It's almost like we're invisible inside of these caring relationships. People just get accustomed to taking from us. And what moved me the most was that hearing women, they were starting to put themselves back into the conversation. Literally, they were saying, why am I the one to do it all? Why are these responsibilities falling into my lap and nobody else is questioning them? And there was agency, right? There was so much agency in saying, nope, I don't want this. I don't want this for my life anymore. What some of these women were saying was profound because the moment that you put yourself back into the center of the decision, everything begins to change. And you're finally acknowledging that your needs belong in the conversation as well. You are a human. You have a limitation to what you can give because you are human. In fact, someone actually said that you are not a robot. And for so many years and for so many generations, women have been literally treated like robots. Like we're supposed to just do everything. And we're supposed to do everything for everyone else. And, there were definitely differences in the way in which some of the women wanted to give. I think it's really important to say, too, that there were differences across the extent to which women were willing to give. Some of them joyously gave, and we should definitely create space. Like we have, based on your own individual experience, you have to determine what is going to be the most giving that you can do. And only you can decide that for yourself. And I definitely saw that on this call. There were so many differences in the extent to which women were willing to do things. And we should honor that. And we should celebrate that. And we should create space for that individual decision making, right? Because everybody's going to be different. But what I learned from the women is that the default can no longer just fall upon us as the responsible ones. We can't just fall into that thinking and not think that there's not going to be some sort of physical or mental health or emotional consequence to the way in which that impacts that woman. Takeaway number 3, we are finally, hooray, normalizing this conversation. So the third thing that I learned is how important it is that we are finally talking about this. Because for so long, we have been in these silos, right? That we've been carrying these loads quietly and privately. And I think that for me, I thought that I was so alone in feeling this way. I thought I was failing. I thought I was doing something wrong. But what I saw in this room was exactly the opposite. Women were recognizing themselves in one another's story. I could see myself in their story as well. And it generates this feeling of collectiveness, right? Like it enables us to see that I am not the only one. I am not crazy. I am not inept or inadequate. This isn't just a me thing. And I think that there is so much power in naming the reality, in saying that this is not working, that this isn't sustainable, that I don't want to do this. Let's normalize that. Let's normalize saying, I don't want to do this, saying that to our parents, saying that to our grandparents, to our kids, to our spouse, to our work, to our boss, whoever is taking from you in that relationship. We should normalize saying that I don't want this. And we need to rethink how this responsibility is distributed. We need to rethink how care happens and how households function. And we need to rethink how workplaces function. And at the end of the day, maybe it's too big or grandiose. And I don't know, maybe this is the limitation of my own brain to say that next week it's going to dramatically change. But here's the thing that I saw that was just so insanely powerful in this room. There were women who were recognizing that we needed the change, and they were saying that. They were saying that to one another. They were crying out to one another that we need to change. What gives me so much hope is seeing women willing to say this out loud. So the biggest thing that I learned from this workshop was that women were beginning to realize that they have choices and that they have a right to question, a right to reconsider, a right to want something different, a right to acknowledge that they also have a capacity, that they have boundaries, perhaps most importantly, that we are all human and that we have a right to matter, not after everyone else, not when everything else is done, now, today, presently, in this moment. Now, hear me out. This does not mean that you love your people less. And I invite you to consider how this actually grows your capacity to love them even more when you start to say no, because finally you are at the center of that decision making. You are acknowledging your own needs, and you have the capacity to take better care of them when you say, I need to take care of myself first. What I witnessed wasn't a room full of women looking for better coping strategies, okay? It was a room full of incredible women asking, what would it look like to build something different? And again, this is a very individual and a very personal decision because people have different capacities, right? People want different things for their life. Let's definitely not come from a place of judgment. Let's not say to one another, like, you should do this or you should do that, because again, this is going to really depend on everybody's individual decision. But the point is that we have a right to define what that feels like in our own life. And so next week, I hope you come back because we're going to talk about part 2. What would it look like to build something different? So come back next week for more. Thanks for joining me on this episode of Courage Class. I hope today's conversation gave you a little encouragement and inspiration. If you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe so you never miss an episode. And for extra motivation, tools, and behind-the-scenes content, sign up for my newsletter. I'd love to share with you more there. See you next time. All right, and now for the legal language. Courage Class with Dr. Lindsay Kwok and content posted by Dr. Lindsay Kwok is presented solely for general informational, educational, and entertainment purposes. The use of information on this podcast or materials linked from this podcast or website is at the user's own risk. It is not intended as a substitute for the advice of a physician, professional coach, psychotherapist, or other qualified professional diagnosis or treatment. Users should not regard or delay in obtaining medical advice for any medical or mental health condition they may have and should seek the assistance of their healthcare professional for any such conditions.